Welcome everybody. We're moving along with our entrepreneurship course here in the Eller online MBA program. I trust that your projects are going very well. We're excited to see the progress that you're making on them. Today we're going to deviate from the material that is directed right at your projects, and we brought in a guest speaker to talk about another aspect of entrepreneurship. And so what I'd like to do is turn it over to Justin, who's going to introduce our guest speaker today.
So thanks, Joe, and I'd like to welcome Aaron Eden. Aaron's a friend of mine for 4 or 5 years now, and Aaron and I have worked together closely on developing entrepreneurial programs here in Tucson. And Aaron's background, I'd like to have him share a little bit about it, but I think it's directly relevant to the students in our program right now, and particularly because of their professional careers. You're not typically coming as an entrepreneur into an MBA program. You're typically working for another company in your career and looking perhaps to move on to another company after you graduate. And there's a great deal of experience that Aaron has had in helping people inside companies develop entrepreneurial thinking. So Aaron, welcome, and thank you for joining us
Thanks for having me.
So Aaron, can you kind of give a little bit of a profile of your background so students kind of get an understanding of where you've come from?
Yeah, absolutely. So I originally was a software engineer since I was about 12, and worked for the Army, worked for Intuit, worked for a handful of other companies. My career sort of took a giant right turn. I moved from doing like data warehousing and data development type things for the enterprise, and moved into HR. I was doing university recruiting, helping employees to grow their careers inside the company, doing leadership development. Like somehow I shifted into all of that. It was actually a result of applying some of the things that we're going to talk about today. Really, it was me taking some of the things that were happening in my entrepreneurial activities outside the company and bringing those inside the companies I was working for. And as a result of it, I started getting promotions, started seeing all kinds of success inside the company. And when I had the pleasure of helping other people do the same thing, saw similar for them. And so over the last couple of years, I've trained probably 3,000 employees across many of the Fortune 100 companies, coached senior leadership all the way up to CEOs and C-level executives, certified coaches that are helping others inside their own organizations. So I've kind of got it's really been an amazing ride, but really had the pleasure of kind of working with employees at all levels, and so applying the things that happen in a startup, the entrepreneurial thinking, the way of behaving, actually has unlocked huge opportunities for tons of employees in companies in many different industries. So I'm excited to hopefully share some insights around that for all of your students and go from there.
And Aaron, I think it's particularly important for this group of students. Justin laid the groundwork a little bit, but we have a diverse set of backgrounds among the students. Some are managing people in large organizations, some are hoping to manage people in large organizations, and some are still students actually, who are working their way up and getting ready to go join other organizations. So the topic of how do you be entrepreneurial in a large organization or even a medium-sized organization is pretty topical. Unlike you, I didn't start engineering at 12. I waited until I got out of college, but I experienced a lot of the same frustrations working in the large companies. How do you do something new and innovative? So maybe you can share with the class a bit about how do you approach this, and how do you even go get started making this leap to being innovative and being entrepreneurial?
Absolutely. So I think there's a couple key things to think about in that. So if you're an employee where all of the work that you do is in service to other employees in the company, I'll talk about that as one topic. And then if you're an employee who's focused on doing things for the customers outside of the company, that's sort of another lens that you should apply this thinking in. So in the first one, where your customers are actually other employees inside the company. So I work for an IT department, I work for finance, I work for HR, any of those functions, or even some inside some of the businesses where maybe I don't ever touch the customers, but I'm doing internal projects, those kinds of things. the opportunity to think like an entrepreneur inside those areas is actually, I would say it's actually more powerful than even in the customer-facing side of things, because most employees just don't think and behave that way, right? So as an example, one of the clients that I've been working with, there's a team in finance. This team in finance is responsible for identifying gaps between different financial systems. So, hey, we had a customer put an order into this system, it gets automatically transferred into this other system, and the responsibility of this operational team is to look for orders that don't make it from system to system and make sure the customer still gets the product that they ordered. This team started applying design thinking, applying lean startup principles to go out and actually start interacting with those customers where the orders were getting stuck and finding out what happened there. Instead of just trying to fix the systems issue, they started behaving like they were product owners and went out and actually interacted with those customers. And in many cases, they discovered that a lot of these orders were being dropped because the credit card that was on the account had just been expired. It was sort of a renewal type program. They discovered that they thought the customers didn't want the product, and that's why they never gave us the updated credit card number. It turned out the customer actually just never got the email because we had an old email address for them as well, and we saved them from having a bad situation where these small business owners, the customers in this case were small business owners, and this was like a payroll product. So if they weren't able to pay their employees the next day because this subscription had run out, they would have looked really terrible in front of their employees. And this team found that a whole bunch of these customers just had bad email addresses, and the customers actually were ecstatic that the company was reaching out to them to ask them, hey, what happened with this order? Why can we help you? That kind of thing. They're like, wow, I never expected that. We found that Net Promoter Scores went up just as a result of calling the customers. The really powerful thing in all of that was that this was a self-contained 4-person team, behaved like entrepreneurs, right? Went out, said, what's the customer's problem? How can I solve the problem? What can I put in place in the organization to solve this on a consistent basis? So what they ended up doing after literally like 2 days of work to figure that out, they ended up putting in what they call a customer saves team that basically would call the customers that had these orders and say, hey, I think your credit card may be out of date. Do you still want your subscription? We'd be happy to update it for you. Save the company about 15% in lost revenue in that business unit with 2 days worth of work, right? Now they've spun up these saves teams all over the company, and one of the things that's starting to happen now is they're like, well, wait a minute, this is not fixing the root cause for this issue. Actually, this is just Band-Aid. And so that team has started to do things like split testing the emails that customers get that tells them their credit card was expired, just like a marketing team would do, but split testing those customer service emails to try to figure out which ones the customers open more of to get customers more likely to put their credit card info back in and not need to call them. So I think that's a perfect example of a finance team behaving like a product team, right? They got out with the customers, they understood the problem the customer had, they put a solution into place, and then figured out how to kind of elegantly scale that up. So that's sort of an example on the internal facing side, right? Like how can a team that's not launching a brand new product or service, like how can they innovate? And it's more of an incremental innovation. That's not like a game-changing thing that they just did, but it made a huge impact to the company, and they looked wonderful as a result of it inside the company, right?
Well, it seems like the way to think about that is that entrepreneurs tend to build things and own things as a result. Like they see a problem, they identify a problem, they own the solution of the problem.
Exactly right.
Which is the transformation I think you're referring to is the difference between an employee who thinks like an entrepreneur and an employee who thinks in a traditional, here's my role, here's my responsibility.
Right.
I think it's a leadership, right? It's a leadership training activity at the end of the day, right? Entrepreneurs tend to be very leadership focused as well.
Yeah, I think so. I think maybe the term leadership may. I think at the beginning what you said, ownership. I think that's really it is. It's like really taking ownership and being empowered to make that change. Like not saying
you're making the distinction between ownership and leadership.
Correct.
Can you talk about the distinction you're making?
Well, I think you still do want leadership behavior and leadership on the team, but I think oftentimes people hear that and they think management. And it's not management. It's actually the behavior of leadership and driving that change and taking ownership. So I think, from my perspective, it feels like more of the ownership. but there's definitely some
Learning
overlap and
outcomes.
similarities. Yeah, exactly.
And in a
exactly.
way, it's a variation on self-managed teams where you're empowering people to take charge of a problem or a project and see it through to its completion.
Exactly right.
Now, before you give another example, I want to, because there's some terminology that we're using, and I want to make sure that the students understand this. One of them being, you talked about lean launch principles, which much of this class is designed around. You also talked about design thinking, and I would be willing to bet there's at least one or two students in the course who are thinking, well, isn't this trying to ferret out problems or processes that aren't working? Isn't this similar to, say, a Six Sigma process?
Right.
So can you tell us, since you're focusing on both lean launch and design thinking, can you tell us the difference between them?
Yeah. So. And probably should throw in there Six Sigma too for that example, right? But so design thinking is also known as human-centered design, right? Which is like getting out and understanding my customers down at an emotional level, right? Understanding what makes them tick, what's driving their decisions, what's driving their behaviors, those kinds of things, through observation, through prototyping, through interviewing, interacting with my customers, but like getting to the point where I understand them really deeply. And then going from there, now I have a problem, a really important problem that I've discovered for a certain type of customer. Now I'm going to brainstorm, I'm going to explore a whole bunch of possible solutions for that customer. And I'm going to pick one of them, and then that one I'm going to move forward with prototyping and experimenting and try to figure out, does it actually solve the problem for that customer, right? So that's sort of design thinking or human-centered design in a nutshell. There's a lot of tools and frameworks underneath that, but like that's sort of it in a nutshell, which is like focus on the end customer and understand the needs of that customer and build what that customer needs, not what you need, not what you know, it's not about revenue goals, those kinds of things. It's about solving an important problem for that customer. So it's kind of a different way of looking at things from a business perspective. On the lean startup side of things, lean startup is very heavily focused on that hypothesis-driven experimentation and the business context around things. So great, I have this wonderful insight and these cool things, important problems that I discovered from my customer's perspective. Now I'm going to rigorously figure out what are the things that are riskiest about this new idea, and one by one I'm going to try and knock those off the table and reduce as much risk about this brand new idea as possible. I would do that in a very rigorous and systematic way. And by doing that, over time, I'll figure out the idea that I started with is almost never the idea that I'm going to end with. And so I'm constantly changing it based on what I'm learning from the customer. So the two of them are extremely complementary. You're taking that hypothesis, you're going out with real customers, you're testing it, and you're using that as an opportunity to gain more empathy for the customer and then come back and tweak your product in an agile and iterative fashion, right? So for your students that are on the engineering side, that are maybe using Agile or Scrum or those types of methodologies for developing new products and services, it's also extremely complementary to that in that it's taking small pieces and going through and testing.
It isn't necessarily getting that emotional connection to customers.
Yeah, exactly right, exactly. So it adds that piece to it. And then the last piece is Six Sigma. So Six Sigma is I'm going to throw out another set of terms. Your students have probably heard it if you guys are using lean launchpad style stuff. So search versus execute, right? Which is in any sort of existing business that's doing well, a large company that you're working for, the majority of the work that's done inside that enterprise is about execution and about executing really well, right? And that's where Six Sigma comes in, like get to the 6 nines of perfection in your processes and those kinds of things, right? That's all about execution. Design thinking and lean startup are all about search. So they're about, if I've got a lean process, a Six Sigma process that I'm looking at, and there's some change that I'm going to make in that process, right? That change is new and it's got some level of uncertainty baked into it. And so I would then take that new innovation, that new thing that I want to bake into that process, I would use the lean startup and the design thinking principles to go and test that thing until I've got some level of confidence that really is going to work. And then now I'm going to throw it back into the Six Sigma process and ensure that I can get my process back up to 6 nines, right? So they're two different tool sets. They're used in completely different contexts, but they can also be, if you understand how to use all of them, you can actually kind of fit them together and get a lot of benefit from it.
So can you talk a little bit about the second example? So we were talking about inside the enterprise initially. Can you talk a little bit the second example you were bringing up?
Customer-facing.
Yep.
Yeah, so the customer-facing example of how to apply lean startup principles as an employee inside the organization. This one tends to be the one that I think people naturally think of, which is how do I use these tools to launch a brand new product or service inside the organization? So there's that, and then there's how do I use this to do more incremental innovation against my existing products and services, right? How do I get from the iPhone 5 to the iPhone 6 versus like what before the iPhone existed, like the invention of the first iPhone, right? They're different, right? And so, excuse me. And so in those cases, it's pretty straightforward as far as applying these. They're very similar to how you apply in a startup. The exception being that it's twice as hard to launch a new product or service inside the enterprise. Well, I say twice. It's probably 10 times harder to launch a new product or service inside the enterprise as it is in a startup, because you've got the existing brand, you've got the existing legal policies, you've got the rules and regulations. You've got all of these things that are put in place inside the organization to protect the core business, which absolutely it should. And to keep the organization executing well, you need all those policies and procedures in place. But to innovate, it's a completely different set of measurements, completely different set of policies and procedures. And so depending on how mature the organization is that you're trying to do this inside of will determine how much of those core resources from the existing business that you try to leverage. In an organization that's very immature from an innovation perspective, you're going to want to try to do all of that search work, all of that new product development, like as far from the core business as possible. In an organization that's more mature, you're able to run the two more side by side because the leadership and the employees understand that those things have to be measured differently and have to be treated differently.
When you talk about mature, are you talking about an organization, their maturity of management, the openness to managing innovation, or are you talking about companies that have been well established in what their existing operations are? It seems like maturity could go either way. So what do you mean?
Yes. Yeah, so I was talking about maturity from an innovation perspective.
So having strong leadership who gets innovation, you can bring it a little bit closer.
Exactly.
But and so thinking about it from the perspective of students in the class, what have you seen how have students effectively, or how have employees effectively introduced this process into management?
Yeah.
Right? When management isn't as innovative as they might want, because they're starting the innovation process now.
Yeah.
How do you begin that transformation as an employee? How have you seen that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like,
have you lived that?
Yeah, I've lived it, yes, and seen it with many companies. And like one of the early questions that I usually get from people that are like, yeah, this seems interesting, I want to do this inside my company. The first question is, how do I convince management to let me do this? Right. And the answer is, you don't. Don't convince them to do anything. What you do is start applying it on your own projects without telling anybody what you're doing. Learn it and apply it, and make some sort of a business impact on one of your existing projects. So you have one data point that says, I worked this new way. It wasn't perfect. I was still trying to figure it out. Maybe I did it wrong, but like, it seems like this project I got done faster than my other projects, or it seems like I made a bigger impact for our customers on this one than I have on the past ones, or like there's something special about this project that happened as a result of working this way. I think we should explore doing more of this, right? Looking for other people in the organization that already think this way. Find a small little tribe of other guys in the organization that are troublemakers looking to kind of do things a little differently, right? Typically, I say troublemakers because typically, if you're doing this search work, it's completely against the grain for all of the execution that's happening in the organization. So early on, you'll be perceived as like a troublemaker in the organization. But like finding a small group of people that you can work together with to then continue to create that momentum inside the organization. So instead of trying to tell the management instead of telling the management that they should invest in this, you should show them why they should invest in it. And after you do that once or twice, any good leader will look at that and go, well, what are you guys doing over there? How do we get more of that? You guys are outperforming the other teams. You're able to you get more done. Your customers are happier. These other things. You guys as employees are happier. Like, that's actually one of the big insights that we've discovered, is that employees that behave this way are actually happier and stick around in the organizations longer. So
because they're able to make an impact at a higher level than
they actually can see the impact, because you get inside the giant monster organization and you're doing your thing all day long and you don't necessarily see the impact of your work. And so in this case, you actually get to the point where you see the impact of your work directly. You're doing it at a small scale, but after you see success there, you'll scale it up. So you do, it's empowering to the employees, and you know, when I was at Intuit, the first 400 employees that we trained on these methodologies, I was in the HR team at that point in time, and we took a list of the 400 employees that had gone through the course, and we anonymously bounced that off of. We had an internal employee survey. How happy are you working for the company? How likely are you to stick around? Does your boss support you? Like, all those kinds of things that big companies tend to ask their employees every year. We took that list of employees and compared that to the rest of the population of the company, and we found that there was a statistically significant boost in employees feeling like they had control of their career. They could better speak the language of leadership. They actually felt like they were happier working at the company as a result of just learning how to apply these tools in their everyday work. That was after a 2-day workshop. So, like, and that's, you know, seeing, I can honestly say that I've now seen hundreds of employees getting promotions as a result of this, because when you behave like an entrepreneur and you methodically go out and test your assumptions and take the risk off the table, you actually you create for yourself, you create a competitive advantage over the rest of the employees in that you can learn faster. So if I can systematically say the riskiest piece of this new idea is whatever this assumption is, customers will pay for it, customers will sign up for it, it will make a positive impact on the customer's life, whatever that assumption is about my new idea, if I can knock that risk off the table with real data, either that the answer is yes, customers will do that thing and I should move forward with this idea, or in many cases the answer is no, customers don't care about that thing, and you can stop that project right then, and you can focus your energy, focus your time on something that's higher impact, right? So as a result of that, now as an employee, I can actually outperform all of the other employees around me. So it gives you a competitive advantage, and eventually when you transform the culture of the company into one where everybody's behaving this way, the company has a competitive advantage.
It sounds very similar, let me put it this way, to when we teach anyone to try and want to make change in their organizations. We often talk about building a business case, but you can build a business case conceptually, right?
At the whiteboard.
In this case, you're actually going out and you're testing it actively, and so it's a more active form of change than it is just one sitting around and thinking about how things might be different.
Absolutely.
Right?
So
That's why the first recommendation is always don't try to convince anybody. Just go start doing it and see what the benefit is to you personally first. And then that will fuel your fire to continue to try to change your team and then your department and then go beyond that.
You had mentioned your background in oil and gas, and feeling like maybe that's not the most mature innovation culture, to use Aaron's framing of that. Looking back, how would you see this sort of methodology fitting in the work that you've seen or the programs that you've done? Do you see how you might be able to introduce this? I mean, have you had experiences that kind of fit this environment? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, you do. And I worked in the oil industry at a time when we were trying to implement change, but the problem is in a large, for lack of a better word, manufacturing process. As an engineer, you had to get people's approval to do new things, and so we spent a lot of time trying. We could come up with ideas to have them, but we didn't have the latitude to implement them. We had to do a lot of convincing, and so that's why I say in a large enterprise, I could make the case, but I still had to do the on the ground, sitting on a location, trying to talk some decision maker into putting a new piece of equipment into play or trying a new process. And I think if I were trying to do this now, I would actually go back to how I was designing things, and I would work new designs in myself, and maybe try them on a very small scale. And I think part of it is building a relationship with somebody who's willing to try innovative things, and to be able to say, hey, I have an idea, let's try this. I think it might lead to an improvement in things, and if it doesn't work, we won't tell anybody in terms of doing it.
And it sounds like one of the constraints that you're operating within, and maybe you've got some experience with other companies that are similar, is that there's large capital investments that are at play, and high precision systems that cost a lot if they are not wired together properly.
The larger the capital investment, the greater the risk for trying something that is unknown, right? And so for us, it would be drilling wells is what I did for a living. And so trying new equipment or new techniques was always risky because it was the technology we used was very old. There was a lot of local lore that people used. There was a lot of superstition. And so overcoming all of that to be entrepreneurial was very hard. Now, I can imagine being entrepreneurial in processes. And that's one of the things I heard is sometimes we're going to do a process different rather than try a new product or a new market in terms of doing it. And so there may be, from what I'm hearing from you, there may be small scale ways people can do things without in their organizations without as much risk, that without threatening a large project or threatening somebody's integrity, that can be able to demonstrate the value of entrepreneurial thinking.
Well, and it's interesting because so the methodology that you're teaching your students around going out and launching new products and services, right? Go out, understand the customer, go get one customer first, figure out how you can solve that problem for that one customer, do that successfully. Then now look at the next level up. 2 customers, 5 customers, what's the next level? But don't touch the 5 customers until you've proven you can do it once, right? And you're slowly scaling that up. And you use that exact same process for the internal change management. So let's say that going time traveling like you guys were just doing. Let's say that you were back on that. In that example, if you did have an idea for a new big piece of machinery to bring into the organization, and there were no small scale tests that you could do. Let's just pretend that it absolutely wasn't possible. There probably were, but let's pretend that it wasn't possible. The only thing to do was bring in a $10 million new machine, and like you're trying to convince your boss of that. You actually apply the same methodology. Maybe your boss isn't, your boss is going to be really difficult, and so your boss isn't the first one you go after. You go after one of his peers, and you talk to him over lunch and understand kind of what his concerns might be. Get empathy for him, understand what his drivers are, understand what metrics he's trying to make, understand what's going on in his head, and use that to then understand who else you might talk to literally, like, it's almost like a therapy session. You're talking to them about, like, what problems are you having with this process? What problems are you seeing with the organization? Those kinds of things, to eventually, hopefully you can identify some problem that manager has that this $10 million piece of machinery might help you solve. Could be some morale issue he's trying to solve for his employees. And you're like, wait a minute, this one step in the process is actually upsetting a lot of the employees. I wonder if maybe replacing that with this new machine might solve that morale issue he's talking about. It may not have ever connected it initially. And then sort of building, great, I got him sort of excited about this as a possibility. Now I'm going to go talk to one other, right? And you're doing the same thing. You're testing with them. Well, is it an initial expenditure of $10 million? Like, is that going to fit within their budgets? Or is this something that we're going to have to try to, like, chop up into pieces, or, that kind of thing? But you're applying the same process of getting empathy for the end customer. In this case, it's the managers that need to make the decision, figuring out what problem you can solve for them, testing some possible solutions with them. Is it the $10 million machine? Is there some other thing you can do in between, until eventually you get them to make the change. So you can apply the exact same framework and methodology to getting things done in the organization that you would for launching a brand new product or service.
And I think that's what's really interesting to me about this. There's the systematic experimentation, data-driven decision making that I think a lot of entrepreneurs really need to learn to I think a lot of times they're advised to go with their gut. And I think the framing of starting with your gut and following the data is probably really valuable. Yeah. But as an entrepreneur or as an employee, or just as a person, I've come to really appreciate, you described it as empathy. It's listening. It's stepping outside of your expectations and trying to genuinely understand other people's expectations. And that mindset, I think, as an employee or a citizen or an entrepreneur, really adds value across the spectrum. And it's not something, I think there are people who are inclined to be wired that way, but I think it's a learned behavior that that will benefit those who take the time and invest the energy in doing it. Because at the end of the day, you will find it more capable of making the changes that you want, of bringing and building a team behind you in support. Because as you're saying, you're taking the time to listen to the conflicts that other people might have with the decisions and the thinking that you're putting forward.
Exactly.
When you're teaching people, particularly maybe who aren't in a position of power, who can implement things, to start to apply design thinking to what they're doing, do you start with, and this is a two-part question, so stay with me. Do you start with asking questions and identifying problems, or do you start with generating ideas that we're not doing? And the second part of this is, you said people who do this tend, especially early on, tend to be seen as annoying or troublemakers.
Yep.
So is this, but there's different ways to be annoying. One is constantly advocating for an idea, and the other is constantly questioning, why are we doing things this old-fashioned way? So how do you go about, if someone wanted to implement this in their organization, what do you coach people to do?
Yeah, there's a couple things. So do you go do empathy first or brainstorm first? I recommend that you start with the empathy first and go after a big problem that you discover with your customers, and then brainstorm against that problem. Oftentimes what happens is if you start with the brainstorming side of things, you end up being in a position where you've got a solution that's in search of a problem. You're like, hey, I have this light bulb. Who needs a light bulb, right? And so you're constantly just testing with different customer segments and just randomly going out. It could take you a really long time to find a target customer for that new idea. Oftentimes, R&D departments inside large organizations have this issue. I have this cool new technology that I just invented. Who needs it, right? And so in some cases, that's totally reasonable, but in many cases, if you can help it, it's better to start with the customer. You'll save a ton of time by going after an important problem that your customer has and trying to solve that problem.
So is this partly questioning how we're doing things? Like, am I doing the right things with these customers? Is that another way to frame this?
I think so, yeah. I mean, a lot of companies will go and take customer voice of the customer data, right? They'll take feedback from customers and go, customers keep complaining about this thing. But normally what happens in that case is somebody inside the organization looks at a list that says, 500 customers complained about this one thing being off, and they go and they change it across the entire system. And inadvertently what they do is they make those 500 customers happy, but because there's many different types of customers that they're servicing, they actually end up upsetting a lot of other customers at the same time. And then it's sort of this back and forth, and you never actually, you're always upsetting one group to make another group happy. And so in that example, if you took that voice of the customer data and you went out and actually interacted with those customers, what happens is you start to understand them as individuals. You start to emotionally connect with the problems that you're seeing in them. And you actually, as a human being, you want to solve that problem for that person. And so your natural passion comes out for solving a problem for somebody else versus just who wants this thing and trying to sell this thing to other people. So I think Justin hit the nail on the head before, which is like the human connection part of it is really, really powerful. So definitely the earlier you can get out and start learning from the customers and understanding them, the better off you'll be and the less time you'll waste. This whole methodology is about reducing the amount of time, reducing the waste in the process of trying to create new value for customers, right? Those customers could be employees, they could be outside your company, but you want to do it in the least wasteful way possible, and that means starting with the customer versus starting with your business or starting with the idea. What was the second question?
Second question was, there's different ways to be troublemakers.
Yep.
And one is to constantly be pushing an idea. The other is to constantly be questioning what we're doing and be that nagging person.
Yep.
What do you coach people to do?
So I just got back from 2 workshops with large insurance companies over the last couple of weeks. Literally telling employees the first step of this process is for you guys to go out and talk to your customers and literally having employees turn to me and say, I will get fired if I go talk to our customers. Like, we are not allowed to talk to our customers. All of the policies say that only the market research team is allowed to talk to customers, and they can only do it in a focus group setting, and they can only do it if they pay the customers to be there, which, guess what? You're not going to get good, reasonable feedback from customers that you're paying to be there in a group setting. You're going to get a bunch of garbage. So like literally having employees say, I cannot talk to customers. But in their hearts, they know it's the right thing to do. Once they've done, in those cases, usually I'll say, great, then your proxy starting point is find some employees in the building that you don't know that are potentially a target customer for this product or service. And you're going to go learn from them just so you can learn what it's like to interact with them and see what sort of problems they have. And what happens is they get super excited after that engagement, after interacting with it. Oh my God, they had this problem I could solve. They had this problem I could solve. They get all fired up about it. They go, okay, great. Now it's time for you to go talk to real customers, right? And so usually so in a company that where this is like they're just starting to do this, or maybe you're in a team that's just starting to do this, or a department that's just starting to do this, it's going to require actually breaking some rules to do this. It's going to require talking to real customers, and maybe the legal policies say that you're not allowed to do that. So you've got to go do it after work, or you've got to go and some companies teams will actually go out and they won't be allowed to wear their company gear. They'll have to say that they work for a startup. They'll say, oh, we just formed this new startup. We're working on this new idea. I'd love to get your feedback. And they're not allowed to use the regular brand of their company. There's a lot of tricks that you can use to being able to do that. But that's why the empowerment and that's why the ownership part comes in for employees that are going to behave this way, is that all of those existing policies and procedures are set up to protect the core business, not to enable innovation. And so in order to actually be a successful innovator at the early stages of maturity in an organization, you're going to be breaking some rules. And so that's why some of the policy things, or that's why the troublemaker thing kind of comes into play a little bit. If you're in an organization that's more mature around innovation, it's likely that they've started to set up policies and procedures that are specifically targeted at innovation. Hey, if you're going to interact with less than 5 customers, then you don't have to ask the legal team. As long as you don't keep any of their money, or as long as you don't try to sell them something that doesn't exist, then it's okay for you to interact with customers. Or they set up some light guidelines that say, stay within these guardrails, and legal has still got your back, right? So legal starting to protect the innovation teams as well as the execution teams.
So do you recommend that people who, in a grassroots way, want to start this, that they get a little cover from maybe one level up, or that they do this kind of stealth-like? In an organization that doesn't promote it, that's at a very immature stage of innovation.
Yeah, for a very immature company on that stage, I would say that if I'm the only guy in the company potentially doing this, if I have a signal already historically from interacting with my boss quite a bit that he or she is probably going to be open-minded to this, then maybe I give them a little bit of heads up, like, hey, I'm going to try to make this thing better, just so you know that, like, I'm working on that, right? But oftentimes what stalls innovators out initially is they ask for permission, versus just doing
asking for forgiveness.
Yeah, exactly. Like when you go to your boss and say, hey, I took this one piece of our puzzle and I made it a little bit better, it's performing well, he's going to go, oh shit, that's awesome, let's do more of that, right? Yeah. Like it's not a big deal. And so I just realized I probably shouldn't curse on this video.
That's okay. It's an R-rated class.
All right,
good. So it's really having a sense for what's going on in your organization. What are the politics and
exactly,
and being willing to. I mean, this is about entrepreneurship, so it's being willing to take that risk.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But if you take it on a really small scale, almost always you're generating data that shows positive impact for the company, and so it changes the conversation. It's not, can I go make this thing better? It's, I did this small little thing that took me 20 minutes and it seems to have made it better. Do you want me to spend more of my time on that? And the boss goes, well, of course. Like, why would I not want you to do that? You're making a positive impact for the company. Of course, do more of that. And you're like, great.
Well, and it comes back to the empathy, right?
Yeah.
If you're able to understand your boss or the employer's concerns, right? So their concerns are that we're going to have a front page headline that something you did just destroyed our brand.
Right.
So scoping it down to 1 or 2 or 3 or doing the testing inside the company
Exactly.
helps you to help them.
Exactly.
Right? They don't necessarily know how to get past that. Their job isn't to think about how to get past it. If you take ownership of how can I help you, allow me to get through this, and how can I demonstrate to you that I understand your concerns and the limitations that you need to place on these behaviors, but I'm willing to own the creative process of breaking those rules a little bit and minimizing the risk associated with it. That at the end of the day, that's your best chance at being able to gain the permission or the forgiveness necessary to be able to begin changing the culture that you want to, implementing the culture of change that you want.
I think if, based on your empathy for your boss, if step 1 is ask for approval to break a company rule, he or she is likely to come back and say no. Right? So,
but if what you do when you're bending the rules is do it with the understanding of their empathy, or having empathy for their concerns and mitigating those risks, then what you're going to do is give yourself a chance of keeping your job after you've tested this.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. I think on the flip side too, though, one of the topics that we sort of touched on earlier but didn't dive into is, as a manager in the organization, how can I be innovative, right? And so, the role of a leader in the organization, I think in many execution-focused organizations, the role of a leader has sort of been, I don't know the right way to put it, has sort of incorrectly morphed into the role of a manager, which is making sure that projects are getting done, making sure people are doing what they're supposed to, make sure the butts are in the right seats at the right times, like those kinds of things. But it should be that part of their role is doing that, and the other part of their role is developing their employees, right? The better employees they have, the more they're able to deliver and do all those kinds of things. And with many managers, that's been forgotten, or it's a very, very small percentage of their job because they're so busy doing the other stuff that they just don't have time to focus on the employees. And so, as a manager, I gotta quit doing that. As a manager, if I have empathy for my employees, understand what's important to them, understand where they want to go, understand how I can grow them, then I come up with possible solutions to the problems that those employees are having that are holding them back in their career. And I run experiments with those employees to try to help them with overcoming those barriers inside their careers. If I'm doing those things, my employees are going to grow like crazy, right? If at the same time, my employees are applying these methodologies, my employees are empowered to go out and interact with customers, to learn from customers. Employee goes out, runs some experiments with a customer, says, hey, this version of our, I'm an IT manager, I'm inside the organization, we've got a ticketing system for employees to be able to submit tickets to us to say that their computer's broken, right? I'm one of the employees inside that organization, I own that system. I just figured out that by changing the button at the bottom of the help desk ticket from submit to request technicians help, that actually it changes the mindset of the people submitting the tickets, and they come out happier as a result of using our system by making that one small change. This is actually a real example and has happened. By making that small change, I've discovered that actually the employees inside the organization using this help desk ticketing system feel like they get a better experience from the IT team as a result of that change. Normally, the way that would come about is the employee comes in and says, hey boss, I think changing this button from submit to this other text, I think it's actually going to make happier employees. I think they're going to like using our system better. Is it okay for me to make that change, right? And the boss is going to try to use their experience, use their knowledge, use whatever. They're going to use their knowledge and their experience to help that employee decide whether the button should be one or the other. When you're using these methodologies, the employee goes out, does a small-scale test with real people, and gets some data that shows that the end customers in the organization are happier when the button reads this certain text, comes back to the boss and says, hey, I showed this new button to 30 people. Out of the 10,000 that are using it, I showed it to 30. It seems to have made those 30 happier. I think we should show this to 500 people. but I was a little nervous about doing that without your approval. It seems to make sense to me to show it to 500. 30 was perfect, and we saw a boost in scores. Are you okay with that, right? Boss goes, yeah, makes sense. Watch out for this, this, and this, but yes, it makes sense. It's actually empowering for the leader as well, because now they don't have to make that decision. They're enabling the employee to go get the data from the customer, who's actually the ultimate decision maker, right? You let the data and let the insights from interacting with the customer make the decision.
Flip everything.
Exactly.
Well, and it sounds like the other piece of this is that in production environments, playing around with testing, in software environments, there's often tools and approaches that are built in. Yeah. For someone where that's not their environment, are there other minimal techniques that you might be able to use that give them a tool to approximate that and get them a little bit more information?
Yeah, that's one of the, I think through the Lean Launchpad, through like the workshops that I run with companies, all those different types of things, those tools, which is how do I create other prototypes that let me get a sense of whether this is going to work before I put it into production, right? And so being able to, in the case of like the oil drilling situation, right? You've got a big piece of machinery that's a critical part of that process, but oftentimes what ends up causing those processes to go off the rails is the human interaction with it, not necessarily the machines. And so usually a lot of the issues are human behavior driven. How do I get the employees to press this button when they should, or how do I get them to behave a little bit differently? And so there's lots of tests that you can do around that. When it comes to the equipment side of it, oftentimes that's an execution problem versus a search problem. It's usually, hey, replacing the machinery with this other thing is gonna increase our throughput, or whatever the case may be. And so these methodologies work really well with like will people actually use this thing, or how will they behave with it, which actually for most internal facing projects is the biggest killer of projects. They almost always go off the rails because some team comes up with an idea to replace one system with another, and go and gather requirements from all the folks internally. And those are all based on a whole bunch of assumptions about how people are going to behave. They get all the requirements for this new system. They go through their project plan and execute rolling out whatever this new system is. And then they go back and they go, well, nobody's using this new system. Why? What's going on here? We just implemented this brand new way for people to be able to submit their expense reports, and nobody's using it. What's going on here, right? And there was a bunch of behavioral assumptions that were baked into that yeah, the system does what it's supposed to, but the people don't, and so it doesn't really matter, right? The systems should be there to support the way the humans work. It's like you said, it's sort of flipping the whole thing on its head and empowering, pushing the decision making down as far as possible so that those decisions are being made by the employees that are closest to the customer, whether that's another employee in the company, customer, or a customer outside the company.
So when you're going in and working with companies to get this started, what are some, clearly we're not trying to get you to reveal everything, but because that would defeat the whole purpose. But what are some ways that they can get started? What are some tips that you give people about things to think about?
Yeah. So a couple things. So number one is starting any project by getting super specific about who the target customer is for that project or new product. I'm going to use those interchangeably in this case.
It could be process as well. Who am I trying to affect? Right.
Yep, exactly right. So any of those examples that we've talked about already, I'm using all of that sort of interchangeably, right? So new product, new service, internal project, whatever, all of those the same. So start by understanding the target customer in a lot of depth. So getting down to what are the behaviors this customer exhibits? What are the things that are important to them? If I had a room full of 100 people, how would I spot this customer in the room? What do they do? What do they like? Those kinds of things, right? That's gonna be different by project, but like get specific and be able to describe one customer that would benefit from this product. Like that should be your starting point. When you actually get to that point, then look at whatever you're doing as a business, right? Who's the customer? What value do I add for that customer? All of those different components. Take a stab at a one-page business plan. Fill out a business model canvas for this project, whether it's an IT project or something else, but like spend 30 minutes, take a stab at what the business model is for this new thing that you want to introduce. Those work that business model canvas works just as well for an internal IT project as it does for a brand new product or service. Then take that and evaluate all of the things you put on that business model canvas. Those are all assumptions. So evaluate all of those things and look at what is the thing that's riskiest. What, if I'm wrong about this one box on the canvas, which one of these is most risky to this idea and will cause it to not work? So employees will take snapshots of their receipts for our new expense reporting system, right? That assumption, and then take that assumption, break that down into a very small experiment. How can I go prove that we can get employees to take pictures of receipts, right? In that example, I don't need to build an entire system. I can go find 5 employees that are getting ready to take trips this week and ask them for this one trip to please take pictures of all of their receipts, and I will automatically put it into the expense reporting system for them. If you'll do that, I will do it for you. And then track how many employees actually took pictures of the receipts and sent them to me. You go, wow, only half of the employees actually sent me receipts. Now I'm going to go back and talk to the ones that did it, talk to the ones that didn't, and understand what was different about those. Oh, this guy was traveling to Hong Kong and he only had text service and he didn't want to use his data to be able to send these. And by the time he got back to the States, he'd forgotten about the receipts, even though he took pictures, and he actually took the pictures, but he never sent them to me. Oh, great. We need a system that would actually support offline access for people to be able to take pictures. I know that that's a requirement now based on the behaviors of the employees versus interviewing him. He may have told you that sometimes I'm in a location where I don't have Wi-Fi access, but maybe not. That may have slipped his mind, and it may have been now you launch the system and only half your employees can use it because the other half are traveling internationally and never have data service. I don't know. I'm realizing that I sort of re-described some of the things we were talking about before. Did I get at what you were asking, or should
well,
I?
No, I think you were. So
It's
tips is identify a problem, identify the customer,
Yep.
and then really it's a lot of this is interact with the customer, and so don't just interview them, and, but actually see them at work, see what they do, and let that be the next step in your kind of development. If that's what you see as the riskiest assumption in your business model canvas. You do a lot of training with companies on this. Mm-hmm. Why don't more companies do this? What are the constraints that people have to overcome, and do you have tips for the students on how to overcome some of them?
So because of that, you have this massive gravity of the rest of the organization constantly trying to pull you back to execution mode. No, you can't do that. No, you shouldn't do that. Those kinds of things. So in any organization, there tends to be kind of a driving function in that organization. So in an insurance company, it's likely to be the legal and compliance organization because there's so many government policies that that organization kind of drives the organization. In a technology company, it's likely to be the engineers, right? It'll sort of be the organization sort of turns their head to look that direction, right? Other companies, it'll be the marketing department, whatever. So, but each company kind of has a driving function. Right. And so it'll look a little different in each company, but usually it's that driving function comes out first. You'll hear people say, no, the legal team will never approve that, or no, that's going to tarnish our brand, or those kinds of things. And so honestly, I think at the early stages, it's ignore that as much as possible. If you have to, use your own time, use your own resources to make it happen. And show versus telling, because it's because of the gravity of the existing organization, it's difficult to find approval. When I first started doing this inside of Intuit was a very progressive organization, already doing a lot with innovation, but some of the things that I did was we had Yammer internally, so you could chat with other employees on a private social network that only other employees could see. I posted on that Yammer network and said, hey, who else has read about Lean Startup and is interested in it? And 4 or 5 people responded back and said what they liked about it. Basically scheduled a brown bag lunch with them to just sit down and chat about what they were seeing in their parts of the company, and started to kind of grow from there, right? So as you're getting started, don't necessarily look for permission. You're gonna have to stick your neck out and take a little bit of risk, just like an entrepreneur would. But don't necessarily go at it alone. So find others that you can kind of band together and be your support network, and and help you with what they're seeing in their parts of the company, those kinds of things. And the other tip is always go where you're loved. So if you're already seeing success with projects in other areas, those kinds of things, like those are probably the areas where you want to try and get others in the organization to let you try some of these new things that you're learning. Is areas where you're already seeing success. You've got that trust and rapport built with those leaders or with those orgs, and so don't go fight the hard battles first. Like go after some easy wins first.
Yeah, leverage your wins, if you would, that
exactly.
way, right?
Yeah, build a little
path
momentum.
of least resistance.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So this was a much deeper conversation than I think we had promised you. So thank you for spending the extra time with us. I think this was incredibly valuable, and I think will be very relevant to students who come through the program. So thank you very much.
Glad I could help.
Thanks very much, Aaron.
Thank you.
So please make sure that everybody, that you're getting your projects, your interviews, moving your projects forward. Make sure you're hitting office hours, and we look forward to seeing you next week.